They said the house stood too far from the road, hidden behind willow trees that drooped like mourners at a funeral. But it wasn't the distance that kept people away. It was the whispers, the ones that traveled like smoke from one town to the next, carried on tongues that dared not speak too loudly. Every small community has its secrets, but here, in the forgotten woods of America's heartland, the secret wore a wedding dress, and that dress belonged to a child. 12 years old, her name erased by time, but her face still lingers in photographs locked away in basements and attics, kept out of sight for reasons no one dares to admit. She wasn't married to a man from a distant farm, or a cousin twice removed, or a family friend with wealth to secure. No, she was given to her own brother, not at 16, not at 14, at 12. The most inbred bride in living memory. They said she walked down no aisle, that there was no priest, no flowers, no vows, just a father's nod, a brother's hand, and a silence that fell over the family like dirt being shoveled onto a coffin. To outsiders, it was unthinkable, but to them it was tradition, a bloodline folding in on itself, too proud or too cursed to let outsiders in. When you hear stories like this, your first instinct is disbelief. It sounds too grotesque, too cruel, too unnatural, but that disbelief is what keeps the truth buried. And the truth is this: in rural America, away from the eyes of the state and the church, families wrote their own laws. They convinced themselves that purity of blood was worth more than purity of soul. They convinced themselves that what was wrong to the world was right to them. And this girl, this bride at 12, became the proof of that madness. Her story is not written in history books. It is carved instead into the bones of her children, marked in their faces, passed down in whispers, and preserved in fragments of photographs that are too painful to look at for long. A family's pride became a curse, and that curse was carried by a girl who should have been playing with dolls but instead was forced to carry a husband, her own brother. This is not a story about love. It is a story about ownership, about silence, about what happens when a family convinces itself that the world outside is the enemy, and the only safety lies in folding tighter and tighter into itself. She grew up in a house where the walls knew too much, where every creak of the floorboards echoed with footsteps that should never have come to her room. Childhood slipped from her hands before she could even understand what it was. At 12, she was not a bride in the way the world understands marriage. She was a possession, a claim staked by her older brother, sanctioned by the silence of their parents. And silence is always the loudest accomplice. The family had a saying: blood should never leave the soil it was born from. They whispered it at the table, they muttered it when neighbors came too close. Outsiders were poison, they believed, with strange customs and corrupting ideas. And so they guarded their bloodline like it was sacred scripture, twisting themselves into knots until the holy became the horrific. She became the vessel of that belief, her childhood erased and rewritten in a single night. The neighbors noticed changes. They saw her stop coming to church, saw her belly begin to swell when she was barely more than a child herself. People asked questions, but the family was clever. They spoke of illnesses, of stomach troubles, of a weak constitution passed down through generations. In those days, small towns knew when not to press too hard. Everyone carried their own shame, their own buried histories. So the questions died, just like the truth. But behind the closed doors of that farmhouse, the reality was undeniable. Her brother, the one meant to protect her from the world, had instead become her world. He dictated her days, controlled her movements, claimed her as his wife without ever uttering the word. And she, too young to resist and too bound by blood to escape, accepted her role in silence. Children don't question the rules of their cage. They only learn to survive inside it. There were no marriage papers, no legal bindings, only the weight of expectation. Her brother was not her partner, but her jailer. The house, with its sagging roof and boarded windows, became both cradle and coffin. For her, there was no horizon beyond the cornfields, no possibility of escape. She belonged to the family, to the blood, to the secret that everyone knew, but no one dared to name. And as the seasons turned, the child bride became a child mother, her son born not of love, but of silence and fear. His cries filled the house, but no one celebrated, for they knew in the hollows of their bones that the curse was not ending, it was only beginning. The child she bore was not just a baby, he was a mirror, reflecting back the family's sins with every breath he took. His face carried the unmistakable stamp of his father-brother, his mother-sister, a lineage folded over itself until even God might have turned away. In his eyes, people said, there was something unsettling, too close together, too wide, too knowing for a newborn. Neighbors who caught rare glimpses whispered behind closed doors that the boy looked wrong, though no one dared say the word that was on everyone's tongue: inbred. The girl, only 13 by then, cradled him as if love could undo what had been done, but love could not fix bones that grew twisted, nor could it silence the rumors that drifted through the village. The child was a living testimony, a fragile body that spoke louder than any accusation ever could. And though she held him with the tenderness of a mother, she also carried the weight of knowing that she had been both mother and aunt, both victim and culprit, both child and bride. Her brother, her husband, watched with a strange pride. To him, the boy was proof that their bloodline was intact, untouched by outsiders, preserved like some holy relic. He boasted quietly in the corners of the tavern, his words slurred by drink, while others avoided his eyes. They knew, but they would never confront him. To speak it aloud would mean naming a crime too monstrous for their small, God-fearing town to hold. The girl's body, however, bore the real cost. She was too young, her bones too soft, her frame too small to endure childbirth without consequence. She limped for months afterward, her hips never healing properly. Her face aged before its time, the brightness of her youth drained into shadows beneath her eyes. She stopped laughing, stopped singing, stopped being a child altogether. In photographs, if you can still find them, she looks like a ghost in a young woman's dress, staring through the lens as if she already knew how her story would end. The family closed ranks tighter, making sure the world outside saw nothing, heard nothing, learned nothing. But secrets rot the wood they are built on, and soon the rot began to spread, creeping not just through the house, but through every generation that followed. The boy grew. He walked. He spoke. And with each milestone, he carried his family's curse further down the line, sealing it into history like a brand that could never be removed. By the time the boy could walk, the house was already collapsing under the weight of its own silence. Every floorboard groaned, every wall sagged, as if the structure itself knew it was sheltering something unholy. Neighbors avoided the path that led to the property. Mail was left at the edge of the road. Children were warned not to play near the trees that bordered the land. The family had become a shadow, a name spoken in whispers, a legend that twisted itself into ghost stories told around campfires. But beneath the myths was a truth far darker. The girl, still barely more than a child herself, was carrying another pregnancy before her body had recovered from the first. Her brother, drunk on his own power, treated her not as a wife, but as a vessel, a thing to be filled again and again, as though more children could secure the bloodline he worshipped. She tried to resist in small ways, staying longer in the garden, lingering by the creek, pretending to fall asleep before he entered her room. But resistance in that house was like shouting into a locked cellar. No one heard. No one came. The second child was stillborn. Some say he was malformed, his tiny body twisted in ways too painful to describe. Others say he never cried, never opened his eyes, his life extinguished before it even began. The girl's screams during labor were said to echo through the woods, chilling even the animals into silence. And when it was over, when the body was wrapped and buried under an unmarked patch of dirt behind the barn, the family never spoke of it again. Not a prayer, not a word. Only silence, heavier than the earth itself. From that moment, something in her broke. She no longer looked at her brother with fear, only with a hollow vacancy that unsettled even him. She obeyed without question, but her eyes betrayed nothing. Neighbors noticed her absence from the market, her absence from church, her absence from life itself. The girl who once ran barefoot through fields now moved like a ghost, gliding through her own existence with no will of her own. And yet the story did not end with her silence. The boy she had borne, her son, her nephew, was growing, and in his features the townspeople saw the family's shame etched deeper each year. He carried the curse like a banner, and the world could not unsee it. If you're still here, you're already braver than most, because this is the part of the story where the silence becomes unbearable, where the truth pushes up from the ground like weeds through broken stone. And I need to ask you, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have broken away, or would you have carried the curse forward in silence? Tell us in the comments, because stories like this survive only when people are willing to confront them. The boy grew into a teenager, his body stretched thin and uneven, his features marked by the lineage that made him, his eyes never aligned, his jaw didn't quite set right, and his voice carried a strange echo when he spoke. Neighbors avoided looking at him directly for fear that their pity or their disgust might slip through their expression. He was both child and reminder, flesh and living evidence of what the family had done. And as he grew, so too did the whispers. Some said the brother-husband planned to marry the boy to his mother once she reached 18, as if rewriting their roles could cleanse the stain. Others whispered that he would pair the boy with a younger sister, should one be born, locking the family even deeper into its own blood. No matter which rumor was true, the direction was the same, further inward, further corrupted, further lost to the outside world. The bride, still little more than a girl herself, carried this knowledge like a stone inside her chest. Her body was worn down, her spirit almost extinguished, but she could not escape the inevitability of her brother's control. There were nights she was said to stand at the window, staring out at the road, as though waiting for someone, anyone, to come and break the chain. But no one came, and maybe she already knew they never would. In this part of America, the land was vast, but the silence was vaster. Officials rarely visited. Neighbors knew when to mind their own business, and churches, even when they suspected, preferred to pray the shame away rather than drag it into the light. That was how generations of secrets survived, because no one wanted to see what was right in front of them. And so the most inbred bride, taken by her brother at 12, carried her life like a living coffin. Every child she bore became both her curse and her confession. And with each year, the line between victim and participant blurred, leaving behind not a clean story of right and wrong, but a stain that soaked into everything it touched. There came a point when her body could no longer keep the family's secrets hidden. By 17, she had carried more pregnancies than her frame was ever meant to endure. Some ended in stillbirths, others in infants who lived only long enough to take 1 or 2 breaths, and yet the brother pressed on, convinced that God had chosen their bloodline for something greater, that every lost child was merely a test of faith. In truth, it wasn't faith, it was obsession. And obsession always leaves bodies behind. Her face told the story long before her voice did. Neighbors described her as looking twice her age, her skin pale and drawn, her eyes hollowed into dark caverns. She moved with a limp that never healed, the damage of childbirth carved permanently into her bones. When she did appear in public, whispers followed her like shadows. Children asked questions their parents couldn't answer. Was she a widow? Was she sick? Why did she look so tired, so broken, so old before her time? No one dared tell the children the truth, but the silence told them enough. The boy she had first brought into the world grew older, and with each year his resemblance to both mother and father became harder to deny. His features twisted by the burden of lineage, he carried their curse in ways that were no longer whispered but openly seen. Teachers noticed, shopkeepers noticed, strangers passing through town noticed, and the more people saw, the more the family retreated. The house became a tomb, its windows shut, its doors locked, its occupants disappearing into themselves. Some say she tried to run, that one night, barefoot and desperate, she carried her son down the dirt road, hoping to vanish into the forest. But her brother found her. He always found her. And when she returned, limping, eyes swollen from tears, no one dared to ask what had happened. They already knew. She was his possessor, not his partner. His sister, not his equal. His bride, not by choice, but by force. The rot of the bloodline was no longer just inside their home. It was etched into their faces, their movements, their very existence. The community could no longer pretend not to see. But still, they said nothing. Because to speak would be to acknowledge that the horror was real, and once a truth like that is spoken, it can never be silenced again. The final years of her life were not years at all, but days stretched thin, hours that bled into one another under the heavy shadow of her brother's control. By the time she turned 19, her body was failing in ways that could no longer be hidden. Continuous childbirth, malnutrition, and the sheer weight of despair had left her fragile as glass. Her skin clung to her bones, her breath came shallow, and her steps faltered like those of an old woman trapped in a young girl's shell. It was during her last pregnancy that the curse of silence claimed her fully. The labor was long, endless, cruel. Witnesses, few as they were, said she screamed until her voice broke, then fell into a terrible quiet, her body convulsing as though it no longer belonged to her. The child was delivered, but the girl was not. She bled into the sheets, her life spilling out faster than anyone could stop. At 19 years old, the most inbred bride was gone, carried into the grave before she had ever truly lived. Her brother refused to weep. To him, she was not a sister, not even a wife, but a vessel. He buried her in the woods behind the house, unmarked and unremembered, a secret folded into the soil just as their parents had intended. The children she bore, those who survived, were raised in that same silence, taught to fear the outside world, taught that blood must remain pure no matter the cost. But the land remembers what people try to erase. Those who pass by the ruins of that farmhouse say the air still feels heavy, as if the ground itself mourns what happened there. Some claim to hear a woman's cries in the night, faint and desperate, carried through the trees like smoke. Others speak of photographs found in attics of faces too similar, too wrong, proof that the curse did not die with her but lived on in the children who carried her blood. This story is not a fable. It is not a ghost tale told to frighten children. It is a record of what silence breeds, of how pride rots into cruelty, and of how a family's obsession with blood purity can destroy everything it touches. The most inbred bride was taken at 12, destroyed by 19, and buried beneath a soil that never gave her peace. She should have been remembered as a daughter, as a sister, as a child. Instead, she became a caution carved into bone, a secret America wishes it could forget, but never will. Would you have had the courage to speak if you lived in that town? Or would you too have let the silence swallow her whole?